After 1930, Jung put Liber Novus to one side. While he had stopped working directly on it, it still remained at the center of his activity. In his therapeutic work, he continued to attempt to foster similar developments in his patients, and to establish which aspects of his own experience were singular, and which had some generality and applicability to others. In his symbolic researches, Jung was interested in parallels to the imagery and conceptions of Liber Novus. The question that he pursued was the following. Was something akin to the individuation process to be found in all cultures? If so, what were the common and differential elements? In this perspective, Jung's work after 1930 could be considered as an extended amplification of the contents of Liber Novus, and an attempt to translate its contents into a form acceptable to the contemporary outlook. Some of the statements made in Liber Novus closely correspond to positions that Jung would later articulate in his published works, and represent their first formulations. Footnote. These are indicated in the footnotes to the text. End footnote. On the other hand, much did not directly find its way into the collected works, or was presented in a schematic form, or through allegory and indirect allusion. Thus Liber Novus enables a hitherto unsuspected clarification of the most difficult aspects of Jung's collected works. One is simply not in a position to comprehend the genesis of Jung's late work, nor to fully understand what he was attempting to achieve without studying Liber Novus. At the same time, the collected works can in part be considered an indirect commentary on Liber Novus. Each mutually explicates the other. Jung saw his confrontation with the unconscious as the source of his later work. He recalled that all his work and everything that he subsequently achieved came from these imaginings. He had expressed things as well as he was able, in clumsy, handicapped language. He often felt as if, quote, gigantic blocks of stone were tumbling down upon him, close brackets. One thunderstorm followed another, end quote. He was amazed it hadn't broken him, as it had done others such as Schreber. Footnote, Memories, page 201, and Protocols of Anelia Jaffe's interviews with Jung, for Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Library of Congress, Washington, page 144, end footnote. When asked by Kurt Wolff in 1957 on the relation between his scholarly works and his biographical notes of dreams and fantasies, Jung replied, "That was the primal stuff that compelled me to work on it, and my work is a more or less successful attempt to incorporate this incandescent matter into the worldview of my time. The first imaginings and dreams were like fiery molten basalt, from which the stone crystallized, upon which I could work." Footnote, Memories, Dreams, Thoughts, C.G. Jung, editor Anelia Jaffe, page 201, end footnote. He added that, "It has cost me 45 years, so to speak, to bring the things that I once experienced and wrote down into the vessel of my scientific work." Footnote, Ibid. Close footnote. In Jung's own terms, Liber Novus could be considered to contain, among other things, an account of stages of his process of individuation. In subsequent works, he tried to point out the general schematic common elements, to which he could find parallels in his patients and in comparative research. The later works thus present a skeletal outline, a basic sketch, but left out the main body of detail. In retrospect, he described the Red Book as an attempt to formulate things in terms of revelation. He had hope that this would free him, but found that it didn't. He then realized that he had to return to the human side and to science. he had to draw conclusions from the insights. The elaboration of the material in the Red Book was vital, but he also had to understand the ethical obligations. In doing so, he had paid with his life and his science. Footnote: Protocols of Amelia Yaffe's interviews with Jung, for Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Library of Congress, Washington, page 148, end footnote. In 1930, he commenced a series of seminars on the fantasy visions of Christiana Morgan at the Psychological Club in Zurich, which can in part be regarded as an indirect commentary on Liber Novus. To demonstrate the empirical validity of the conceptions that he derived in the latter, he had to show that processes depicted within it were not unique. With his seminars on Kundalini Yoga in 1932, Jung commenced a comparative study of esoteric practices, focusing on the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, Buddhist meditational practices, and medieval alchemy, which he presented in an extensive series of lectures at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH. Footnote: these lectures are currently being prepared for publication. For further details, see www.philemonfoundation.org. End footnote. The critical insight that enabled these linkages and comparisons was Jung's realization that these practices were all based on different forms of active imagination, and that they all had as their goal the transformation of the personality, which Jung understood as the process of individuation. Thus, Jung's ETH lectures provide a comparative history of active imagination, the practice that formed the basis of Liber Novus. In 1934, he published his first extended case description of the individuation process, which was that of Christine Mann, who had painted an extensive series of mandalas. He referred to his own undertaking. I have naturally used this method on myself too, and can affirm that one can paint very complicated pictures without having the least idea of their real meaning. While painting them, the picture seems to develop out of itself, and often in opposition to one's conscious intentions. Footnote: a study in the process of individuation, Collected Works 9, 1, paragraph 622, end footnote. He noted that the present work filled a gap in his description of his therapeutic methods, as he had written little about active imagination. He had used this method since 1916, but only sketched it in The Relations of the Eye to the Unconscious in 1928, and first mentioned the mandala in 1929 in his commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower. For at least 13 years I kept quiet about the results of these methods in order to avoid any suggestion. I wanted to assure myself that these things, mandalas especially, really are produced spontaneously and were not suggested to the patient by my own fantasy. Footnote Ibid, paragraph 623, end footnote. Through his historical studies, he convinced himself that mandalas had been produced in all times and places. He also noted that they were produced by patients of psychotherapists who were not his students. This also indicates one consideration that may have led him not to publish Liber Novus: to convince himself and his critics that the developments of his patients, and especially their mandala images, were not simply due to suggestion. He held that the mandala represented one of the best examples of the universality of an archetype. In 1936, he also noted that he himself had used the method of active imagination over a long period of time, and observed many symbols that he had been able to verify only years later in text that had been unknown to him. Footnote: on the psychological aspects of the core figure, Collective Works 9, 1, paragraph 334, end footnote. However, from an evidential standpoint, given the breadth of his learning, Jung's own material would not have been a particularly convincing example of his thesis that images from the collective unconscious spontaneously emerged without prior acquaintance. In Liber Novus, Jung articulated his understanding of the historical transformations of Christianity and the historicity of symbolic formations. He took up this theme in his writings on the psychology of alchemy and on the psychology of Christian dogmas, and most of all in Answer to Job. As we have seen, it was Jung's view that his pre-war visions were prophetic that led to the composition of Liber Novus. In 1952, through his collaboration with the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli, Jung argued that there existed a principle of acausal orderedness that underlay such, quote, meaningful coincidences, end quote, which he called synchronicity. Footnote, see C.A. Meyer, editor, Atom and Archetype, the Pauli/Jung letters, with a preface by Beverly Zabriskie, translator D. Roscoe, end footnote. He claimed that under certain circumstances, the constellation of an archetype led to a relativization of time and space, which explained how such events could happen. This was an attempt to expand scientific understanding to accommodate events such as his visions of 1913 and 1914. It is important to note that the relation of Liber Novus to Jung's scholarly writings did not follow a straight point-by-point translation and elaboration. As early as 1916, Jung sought to convey some of the results of his experiments in a scholarly language, while continuing with the elaboration of his fantasies. One would do best to regard Liber Novus and the Black Books as representing a private opus that ran parallel to and alongside his public scholarly opus. Whilst the latter was nourished by and drew from the former, they remained distinct. After ceasing to work on Liber Novus, he continued to elaborate his private opus, his own mythology, in his work on the tower and in his stone carvings and paintings. Here, Liber Novus functioned as a generating center, and a number of his paintings and carvings relate to it. In psychotherapy, Jung sought to enable his patients to recover a sense of meaning in life through facilitating and supervising their own self-experimentation and symbol creation. At the same time, he attempted to elaborate a general scientific psychology. The publication of Liber Novus. While Jung had stopped working directly on Liber Novus, the question of what to do with it remained, and the issue of its eventual publication remained open. On April 10, 1942, Jung replied to Mary Mellon concerning a printing of the Sermones. Quote, concerning the printing of the 7 Sermones, I should wish you to wait for a while. I had in mind to add certain material, but I have hesitated for years to do it. But at such an occasion one might risk it. End quote. Footnote, Jung Papers. It is likely that Jung had Philemon's commentaries in mind. End quote. In 1944, he had a major heart attack and did not see this plan through. In 1952, Lucy Hare put forward a project for a biography of Jung. At Olga Freeby's suggestion and on Jung's insistence, Carey Baines began collaborating with Lucy Hare on this project. Carey Baines considered writing a biography of Jung based on Liber Novus. Footnote, Olga Freeby Kapteyn to Jack Barrett, January 6, 1953, Bollingen Archives. End footnote. To Jung's disappointment, she withdrew from the project. After several years of interviews with Lucy Hare, Jung terminated her biographical project in 1955. because he was dissatisfied with her progress. In 1956, Kurt Wolff proposed another biographical project, which became Memories, Dreams, Reflections. At some stage, Jung gave Anelia Jaffe a copy of the draft of Liber Novus, which had been made by Tony Wolff. Jung authorized Jaffe to cite from Liber Novus and the Black Books in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Footnote: Jung to Jaffe, October 27, 1957, Bollingham Archives. End footnote. In his interviews with Anelia Jaffe, Jung discussed Liber Novus and his self-experimentation. Unfortunately, she did not reproduce all his comments. On October 31, 1957, she wrote to Jack Barrett of the Bollingham Foundation concerning Liber Novus, and informed him that Jung had suggested that it and the Black Books be given to the library of the University of Basel, with a restriction of 50 years, 80 years, or longer, as, quote, he hates the idea that anybody should read this material without knowing the relations to his life, etc. End quote. She added that she had decided not to use much of this material in Memories. Footnote: Bollingham Archives, Library of Congress. Jaffe gave a similar account to Kurt Wolff, mentioning 30, 50, or 80 years as the possible restriction. Undated, received October 30, 1957. Kurt Wolff Papers. On reading the first sections of the protocols of Anelia Jaffe's interviews with Jung, Carey Baines wrote to Jung on January 8, 1958, that it is the right introduction to the Red Book, and so I can die in peace on that score. Carey Baines Papers. End footnote. In one early manuscript of Memories, Jaffe had included a transcription of the draft typescript of most of Liber Primus. Footnote: Kurt Wolff Papers, Beinecke Library, Yale University. The prologue was omitted, and it was given the title of the first chapter, The Recovery of the Soul. Another copy of this section was heavily edited by an unidentified hand, which may have been part of preparing this for publication at this time. Jung Family Archives. End footnote. But it was omitted from the final manuscript, and she did not cite from Liber Novus or the Black Books. In the German edition of Memories, Jaffe included Jung's epilogue to Liber Novus as an appendix. Jung's flexible date stipulations concerning access to Liber Novus were similar to that which he gave around the same time concerning the publication of his correspondence with Freud. Footnote: one may note that the publication of the Freud/Jung letters, crucial as this was in its own right, while Liber Novus and the bulk of Jung's other correspondences remained unpublished, regrettably heightened the mistaken Freudocentric view of Jung. As we see in Liber Novus, Jung is moving in a universe that is as far away from psychoanalysis as could be imagined. End footnote. On October 12, 1957, Jung told Jaffe that he had never finished the Red Book. Footnote: Protocols of Anelia Jaffe's interviews with Jung for Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Library of Congress, Washington, page 169. End footnote. According to Jaffe, in the spring of the year 1959, Jung, after a time of lengthy ill health, took up Liber Novus again to complete the last remaining unfinished image. Once again, he took up the transcription of the manuscript into the calligraphic volume. Jaffe notes, quote, however, he still could not or would not complete it. He told me that it had to do with death. End quote. Footnote: Jung/Jaffe. Erinnerungen, Träume, Gedanken von C.G. Jung. Page 387. Jaffe's other comments here are inaccurate. End quote. The calligraphic transcription breaks off mid-sentence. and Jung added an afterword which also broke off mid-sentence. The postscript and Jung's discussions of its donation to an archive suggest that Jung was aware that the work would eventually be studied at some stage. After Jung's death, Liber Novus remained with his family in accordance with his will. In her 1971 Erasmus lecture, quote, "The Creative Phases in Jung's Life," end quote, Jaffe cited two passages from the draft of Liber Novus, noting that, quote, "Jung placed a copy of the manuscript at my disposal with permission to quote from it as occasion arose," end quote. This was the only time she did so. Footnote, Jaffe, quote, "The Creative Phases in Jung's Life," end quote. Spring, An Annual of Archetypal Psychology and Jungian Thought, 1972, page 174, end footnote. Pictures from Liber Novus were also shown in a BBC documentary on Jung, narrated by Lawrence van der Post in 1972. These created widespread interest in it. In 1975, after the much-acclaimed publication of the Freud/Jung letters, William Maguire, representing Princeton University Press, wrote to the lawyer of the Jung estate, Hans Karrer, with a publication proposal for Liber Novus and a collection of photographs of Jung's stone carvings, paintings, and the tower. He proposed a facsimile edition, possibly without the text. He wrote that, quote, "We are uninformed of the number of its pages, the relative amount of text and pictures, and the content and interest of the text," end quote. No one in the press had actually seen or read the work or knew much about it. This request was denied. Footnote, Maguire Papers, Library of Congress. In 1961, Anelia Jaffe had shown Liber Novus to Richard Hull, Jung's translator, and he had written his impressions to Maguire. Quote, "She, brackets, AJ, close brackets, showed us the famous Red Book, full of real mad drawings with commentaries in monkish script. I'm not surprised Jung keeps it under lock and key. When he came in and saw it lying, fortunately closed, on the table, he snapped at her. Das soll nicht hier sein. Nehmen Sie es weg. That should not be here. Take it away." Although she had written me earlier that he had given permission for me to see it. I recognize several of the mandalas that are included in On Mandala Symbolism. It would make a marvelous facsimile edition, but I didn't feel it wise to raise the subject, or to suggest the inclusion of drawings in the autobiography. Parenthesis, which Mrs. Jaffe urged me to do. Close parenthesis. It really should form part, sometime, of his opus. Just as the autobiography is an essential supplement to his other writings, so is the Red Book to the autobiography. The Red Book made a profound impression on me. There can be no doubt that Jung has gone through everything that an insane person goes through, and more. Talk of Freud's self-analysis. Jung is a walking asylum in himself. The only difference between him and a regular inmate is his astounding capacity to stand off from the terrifying reality of his visions, to observe and understand what was happening, and to hammer out of his experience a system of therapy that works. But for this unique achievement, he'd be as mad as a hatter. The raw material of his experience is Schreber's world over again. Only by his powers of observation and detachment, and his drive to understand, can it be said of him what Coleridge said in his notebooks of a great metaphysician. Parenthesis, and what a motto it would make for the autobiography, close parenthesis. He looked at his own soul with telescope. What seemed all irregular, he saw and showed to be beautiful constellations, and he added to the consciousness hidden worlds within worlds. The citation from Coleridge was indeed used as a motto for Memories, Dreams, Reflections. End footnote. In 1975, Some reproductions from the calligraphic volume of Liber Novus were displayed at an exhibition commemorating Jung's centenary in Zurich. In 1977, 9 paintings from Liber Novus were published by Jaffe in C.G. Jung, Word and Image, and in 1989, a few other related paintings were published by Gerhard Wehr in his illustrated biography of Jung. Footnote: Anelia Jaffe, editor, C.G. Jung, Word and Image, figures 52 through 57, 77 through 79. Together with a related image, figure 59, Gerhard Wehr, an illustrated biography of Jung, pages 40, 140, 141. End footnote. In 1984, Liber Novus was professionally photographed, and 5 facsimile editions were prepared. These were given to the 5 families directly descendant from Jung. In 1992, Jung's family, who had supported the publication of Jung's collected works in German, parenthesis, completed in 1995, end parenthesis, commenced an examination of Jung's unpublished materials. As a result of my researches, I found 1 transcription and a partial transcription of Liber Novus, and presented them to the Jung heirs in 1997. Around the same time, another transcription was presented to the heirs by Marie-Louise Onfrance. I was invited to present reports on the subject and its suitability for publication, and made a presentation on the subject. On the basis of these reports and discussions, the heirs decided in May 2000 to release the work for publication. The work on Liber Novus was at the center of Jung's self-experimentation. It is nothing less than the central book in his oeuvre. With its publication, one is now in a position to study what took place there on the basis of primary documentation, as opposed to the fantasy, gossip, and speculation that makes up too much of what is written on Jung, and to grasp the genesis and constitution of Jung's later work. For nearly a century, such a reading has simply not been possible, and the vast literature on Jung's life and work that has arisen has lacked access to the single most important documentary source. This publication marks a caesura and opens the possibility of a new era in the understanding of Jung's work. It provides a unique window into how he recovered his soul, and, in so doing, constituted a psychology. Thus, this introduction does not end with a conclusion, but with the promise of a new beginning. Translator's note: Mark Kybers, John Peck, and Sonu Shamdasani. At the outset of Liber Novus, Jung experiences a crisis of language. The spirit of the depths, who immediately challenges Jung's use of language, along with the spirit of the time, informs Jung that on the terrain of his soul, his achieved language will no longer serve. His own powers of knowing and speaking can no longer account for why he utters what he says, or under what compulsion he speaks. All such attempts become arbitrary in the depth realm, even murderous. He is made to understand that what he might say on these occasions is both madness and, instructively, what is. Indeed, in a broader perspective, the language that he will find for his inner experience would compose a vast commedia. Quote, "Do you believe, man of this time, that laughter is lower than worship? Where is your measure, false measurer? The sum of life decides in laughter and in worship, not your judgment." In translating this accumulated record of Jung's imaginal encounters with his inner figures, from a 16-year period beginning just before the First World War, we have let Jung remain a man who was pulled loose from his moorings, but also caught up in the maelstrom that has gone by the name of literary modernism. We have tried neither to further modernize nor to render more archaic the language and forms in which he couched his personal record. The language in Liber Novus pursues three main stylistic registers, and each poses distinct difficulties for a translator. One of them faithfully reports the fantasies and inner dialogues of Jung's imaginal encounters, while a second remains firmly and discerningly conceptual. Still a third writes in a mantic and prophetic, or romantic and dithyrambic mode. The relation between these reportorial, reflective, and romantic aspects of Jung's language remains comedic in a manner that Dante or Goethe would have recognized. That is, within each chapter, the descriptive, conceptual, and mantic registers consistently rub against each other, while at the same time, no single register is affected by its partners. All three stylistic registers serve psychic promptings, and each chapter shares a polyphonic mode with the others. In the Scrutinist section from 1917, this polyphony matures, its voices commingling in various ratios. A reader will quickly infer that this design was not premeditated, but rather grew from the experiment to which Jung arduously submitted. The editorial note diagrams the textual evolution of this composition. Here, we need only observe that Jung each time sets down an initial protocol layer of narrative encounter, usually with dialogue, and then in the second layer, a lyrical elaboration of and commentary on that encounter. The first layer avoids an elevated tone, whereas the second welcomes elevation and modulates into sermonic, mantic prophetic reflections on the episode's meaning, which in turn unpack events discursively. This mode of composition, which is unique in Jung's works, was no temperamental arrangement. Instead, as the episodes accumulated and their stakes mounted, it grew into an experiment that was as much literary as it was psychological and spiritual. In Jung's extensive published and unpublished corpus, there is no other text that was subjected to such careful and continual linguistic revision as Liber Novus. These three linguistic registers already present themselves as virtual models for a possible translation. Our practice has been to let them cohabit within the exploratory frameworks alive in Jung's own day. The task before him was to find a language rather than use one ready at hand. The mantic and conceptual registers can themselves be considered as translations of the descriptive register. That is, these registers move from a literal level to symbolic ones that amplify it. In a modern analogue to Dante's Modi Diversi, in his letter to Cangrande della Scala. Footnote: see the translation and discussion of this letter in Lucia Boldrini, Joyce, Dante, and the Poetics of Literary Relations, pages 30 through 35. End footnote. In a very real sense, Liber Novus was composed through intertextual translation. The book's rhetoric, its manner of address, emerges from this interanimating structure of internal translation or transvaluation. A critical task for any translation of the work, therefore, is conveying this compositional texture intact. The fact that painted images of an accomplished and hybrid kind illuminate the medieval format of a folio in scribal hand compounds any reflections on the linguistic task. The novel language required a renewed ancient script. A polyphonic style couches itself multimedia fashion within a symbolic throwback yet forward movement, medieval and anticipatory, into retrievals of psychic reality. Verbal and visual images press in on Jung from the root past and present, while aiming toward the beyond, a layered medium emerges, whose polyphonic style mirrors within its language that same composite layering. Faced with the task of translating a text composed nearly 100 years ago, translators usually have the benefit of prior models to consult, as well as decades of scholarly commentary and criticism. Without such exemplars at hand, we were left to imagine how the work might have been translated in previous decades. Consequently, our translation sidesteps several unpublished or hypothetical models for rendering Liber Novus into English. There is Peter Baines's strikingly archaizing September Sermones of 1925, which draws largely upon a Victorian idiom, or the conceptually rationalizing version that R.F.C. Hull might have attempted had he been allowed to translate it alongside his other volumes in the Bollingen series of Jung's collected works. Footnote: on the issue of Hull's translations of Jung, see Shamdasani. Jung stripped bare by his biographers even. Pages 47 through 51. End footnote. Or the elegant literary rendering from the hand of someone like R.J. Hollingdale. Our version, therefore, occupies an actual position in a largely virtual sequence. Consideration of these virtual models highlighted questions of how to pitch the language within historical shifts in English prose, how to convey the myriad convergences and divergences between the language of Liber Novus and Jung's collected works, and how to render in English a work simultaneously echoing Luther's German and Nietzsche's parody of the same, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Because our version takes this position, accordingly, when we have cited Jung's collected works, we have freshly rendered or discreetly modified the published translations. Liber Novus was coeval with the literary ferment that Mikhail Bakhtin called the dialogical prose imagination. Footnote: see the Dialogic Imagination. 4 essays. Editor: Michael Hellquist. Translator: Carol Emerson and Michael Hellquist. End footnote. The Anglo-Welsh writer and artist David Jones, author of In Parenthesis and The Anathemata, referred to the rupture of the First World War and its effects on the historical sense of writers, artists, and thinkers simply as the break. Footnote: David Jones, Die Greatcoat, a self-portrait of David Jones in his letters. Editor: René Haig. End footnote. In concert with other experimental writing from these decades, Liber Novus excavates archaeological layers of literary adventure with hard-won consciousness as both shovel and precious shard. While Jung actively considered publishing Liber Novus for many years, he chose not to make a name for himself in this literary manner, as much for style as for content, by releasing it. By 1921, with Psychological Types, he already found that his sanctum could furnish him his main themes, through translation into a scholarly idiom. Jung enunciates the tension among his 3 stylistic registers, already addressing a future readership, which shifts from an inner circle of friends to a wider public between different layers of the text. This is graphically apparent in the frequent pronomial shifts between the versions, which show the manner in which he was constantly reimagining the potential readers of the text. Jung coherently adopted this dialogical stance, polyphonic in Bakhtin's later terms, once again mindful of a hypothetical future audience, yet also aloof from the question of audience altogether, not from pride, but simply in view of the aims to be served. Paintings and fantasies from this private treasury entered anonymously as cryptid intertexts into Jung's later work, nestling as hermetic clues to the undisclosed whole of his effort. Indeed, we can imagine Jung laughing when he wrote of, quote, 3, Case Z, end quote, in the last section of his essay on the psychological aspects of the core, 1941. Footnote, Collected Works, 9:1, end footnote. There, he summarizes as anonymous 12 episodes from encounters with his own soul in Liber Novus, calling them a dream series. The comments he appends to these propel the adventurer he had been, and the subject he became in that adventure, into the discourse of a would-be science. The comedy is both spacious and exquisite. This respectful host to the anima also wields the diagnostic pointer in all seriousness. His language flexibly straddled both contexts, but also kept certain veils in place while doing so. This linguistic strategy mirrored Jung's larger aims in remaining fruitfully dual and contextual. Declaring his mysteries to be particular, not to be aped in any way, he nonetheless also offered them as a template of formative spiritual process, and in so doing, attempted to develop an idiom that could be taken up by others to articulate their experiences. This is one way of paraphrasing the considerable anomaly of the language that Jung had to find through sleepless nights from 1913 onward. That language shifted its shape, altered its scale, and weighed both megrims and tons. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that in his more elevated passages, Jung relied on the resonance of the Luther Bible, itself a translation that had achieved rock-like stability within German culture. Ein feste Burg, a mighty fortress. Thus our own reliance here on the King James Version of the Bible, KJV, for comparable tonalities in English. Yet a paradox rises immediately. What Jung counted on in that resonance had transplanted an alien spirit into the Germanic Heimat, or home, as one may likewise say of the KJV's deep embedding of the same implant in Anglo-Saxon culture. Franz Rosenzweig, translating parts of the Old Testament with Martin Buber in the mid-1920s, identified Luther's Bible as the great spacemaker within Germanic spirit, precisely through Luther's close-in moves toward his source. Quote, for the comfort of our souls, we must retain such words, must put up with them, and so give the Hebrew some room, where it does better than German can. End quote. Footnote, Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, Scripture and Translation. Translator Lawrence Rosenwald with Everett Fox. Page 49, citing Luther's preface to his German Psalter. End footnote. Thus our own practice of not smoothing out Jung's several modes, or making them run more fluently than need be, or even regularizing his punctuation. Think of Dante's shaggy diction, or of still another maxim from Luther in Rosenzweig's notes. The mud will cling to the wheel. Footnote, Ibid, page 69. End footnote. Yet even these profound allowances for archaic and original speech across abysses of meaning fail to approximate the destabilizing experience in and through language to which Jung testifies. His later comments in the published memoir on his reservations about high-flown style, in effect cover his tracks in Liber Novus. The original experience sent speech into a spin that animates the book's initiatic dimension. Language too undergoes a descent into hell and the realm of the dead, which divests one of speech even as it renews the capacity for utterance. The following instances give some idea of this factor's range, mapping the stresses in any sincere ventriloquism, such as Jung risked by undertaking a controlled séance with himself and his ground, with pen in hand. Hölderlin's hairbreadth space warps and Isaiah's tongue-born burning coal both move in this league, along with Plato on, quote, right frenzy, end quote, or divine madness. 1. Quote, my cell spoke to me in a whisper, urgently and alarmingly. Words, words, do not make too many words. Be silent and listen. Have you recognized your madness, and do you admit it? Have you noticed that all your foundations are all completely mired in madness? End quote. 2. Jung's soul. Quote, there are hellish webs of words, only words. Be tentative with words, value them. For you are the first who get snared in them. For words have meanings. With words you pull up the underworld. Word, the paltriest and the mightiest. In words the emptiness and the fullness flow together. Hence the word is an image of the God. End quote. 3. Quote, but if the word is a symbol, it means everything. When the way enters death and we are surrounded by rot and horror, the way rises in the darkness and leaves the mouth as the saving symbol, the word. End quote. 4. The dead woman. Quote, let me have the word, oh that you cannot hear. How difficult, give me the word. End quote. It then materializes in Jung's hand as hap, the phallus. 5. Jung's soul. Quote, you possess the word that should not be allowed to remain concealed. End quote. 6. Jung. Quote, what is my word? It is the stammering of a miner. End quote. Soul. Quote, they do not see the fire, they do not believe your words, but they see your mark, and unknowingly suspect you to be the messenger of the burning agony. You stutter, you stammer. End quote. In the protocols for his memoir, Jung recalls bringing to the original experiences in Liber Novus only a, quote, highly clumsy speech, end quote. Footnote. Protocols of Amelia Jaffe's interviews with Jung for Memories, Dreams, Reflections, end footnote. Yet one instance, 7, strongly belies that later emphasis. Quote, I knew that Philemon had intoxicated me and given me a language that was foreign to me and of a different sensitivity. All of this faded when the god arose, and only Philemon kept that language. End quote. This last instance indicates that Jung later attributed the mantic, dithyrambic speech of layer 2 in everything before the scrutinies section to Philemon. The literal intoxication described here is linguistic, a dramatized, ventriloquial version of Platonic divine madness. It therefore underscores our attempt to faithfully render the stylistic registers of Liber Novus, so as to present a vital aspect of Jung's literary experiment, as he grapples with attempting to find the most fitting idiom in which to cast the transformations of inner experience. Jung's search for the soul, then, stands at one with the search for appropriately dialogical and differentiated language. These instances, in all their oscillations, affect a reading of Jung's collected works, and counsel caution with applying its conceptual tools to the task of reading and understanding Liber Novus. To take but one example, one begins to see that it is too neat to equate the opposed yet related depths of Logos and Eros with the conceptual and lyrical mantic registers found in Liber Novus. Jung's commentary on the Elijah-Salome relationship included here shows that relationship to be developmental, a mystery play of the formative process that kindles love for the lowest in us. The modal span for language in Liber Novus thus animates that mystery play, but does not correspond directly to opposed psychological functions. This complex respect for language instructs translators of Liber Novus in navigating the underworld/redemptive tensions spanned by its rhetoric. The great force behind the mantic tension in that rhetoric occupied Jung in the brief epilogue he inscribed in the calligraphic volume in 1959. 2 years before his death. Once again plying the seas of those illuminated pages, he seems to have found any further summing up to be unnecessary. Breaking off in mid-sentence, he left the book to stand on its own, as one strand of discourse within his whole effort. That counterpoint required no comment, any more than did the 3 registers of language within the book itself. Ordeal was commedia after all, calling for no retrospective theoretical justification. Liber Novus would survive the gropings and peltings of reception. Jung had remarked in 1957 to Amelia Yaffe that so much rubbish had been said about him that any more rubbish didn't disturb him. Footnote: Protocols of Amelia Yaffe's interviews with Jung for Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. Page 183. End footnote. That lifted pen therefore confidently consigned the book to its depth trajectory, steeply expanding into the quarry it had become, with both his collected works and the lakeside tower at Bonningham as its final extractions. In this note, we have attempted to convey only the general principles that have guided this translation. A full discussion of the choices that confronted us, and a justification of the decisions taken, would fill